and back again. This can happen rather quickly, and it may even go so fast that you don't even consciously notice it. But because your brain is switching back and forth, that switching does come at a mental cost. We're only able to actually focus deeply on one task at a time. In fact, according to one researcher, instead of making you more productive, multitasking can actually double the amount of time it takes you to complete a specific task, while also potentially doubling your mistakes. That's a pretty significant mental cost. And to make matters worse, when you get distracted, it takes you almost 15 minutes on average to get fully back in the flow. Roughly half of our daily interruptions are self-inflicted. This is why in future lectures, I'm going to be talking about modifying our work environment and setting ourselves up to minimize distraction. Now, for important tasks, which are those tasks that require your full focus and attention, those projects that require problem solving, creativity, it's critical that you focus 100% on one thing at a time and segment out a specific time block where you're only focusing on that critical task in order to produce your best work and get that work done in the shortest period of time. Now, these time blocks are incredibly important for maximizing your productivity and for getting your best results. You've got to turn that phone off, shut off your email alerts, and put everything else aside. And just by focusing on your most important task first, by blocking off that time specifically where all you focus on is that critical task, you'll see huge results. Now, you can experiment with the length of time block that works best for you. Me personally, I find that I can focus for about 60 minutes at a time in most cases before I start to reach that path of diminishing returns. For some people that may be 45 minutes. For some it may be 25. We're going to talk more specifically about how you do this in later lectures. But for right now, I just want you to understand that if you think you're great at multitasking, you're not. Now, if you're doing some really easy, mindless type activities, sure, you can do two things at once. But items that really require your best effort, that really require your focus, your creativity, you've got to set aside time and focus on one task at a time. This next silent killer is kind of a 2-for-1 combo, and I'm talking about fake breaks and time leaks, and I will explain why these two are married together. We all have time leaks. These are the type of things that we do throughout the day that robs us of our productivity. In many cases, we do this so frequently, and it's become such a habit that we don't even realize how this impacts us. I define a time leak as those little things we oftentimes do to give us a break or switch up things between tasks. These can also be items that we focus on when we're procrastinating or just killing time. Now, this slide right here shows you a few of our favorites. Things like checking your Facebook page, checking Twitter, surfing the internet, watching videos on YouTube. Email is such a huge culprit and such a big killer that it has its own lecture coming shortly. Our smartphones and our computers are becoming more and more responsible for the vast majority of our time leaks, but that isn't always necessarily the case. Sometimes it can be gossiping with coworkers, shooting the breeze with friends, or texting with family members. Now, you can't fix something until you know exactly where you're going wrong. So I suggest you take a few days this week and do a time audit. I want you to notice how many times you switch to time leak activities. If you spend lots of time on your computer, you can use an app like Rescue Time to track your activity for you to see where you're spending your time. Rescue Time is a free app, and you can directly load it into your browser, and it will track the websites and the different apps and things that you do on your computer and break them into different categories and track your productivity. Whether you use an app like Rescue Time or some of the myriad of other options that are out there, the biggest thing is for you just to track how often you're taking these fake breaks or engaging in these time leaks, and also to determine how long these activities persist and what your top leaks are. I told you fake breaks and time leaks were married together. So what is a fake break? Now, what you're probably going to find is that many times your time leaks fit into the category of fake breaks, or what I call fake breaks. Those fake breaks are when you're looking for a break from a task or whatever it is your primary project that you're working on. And usually this is by way of the path of least resistance, such as surfing the web or checking apps on your phone. Your instinct is correct. Your brain and your body does need time to rejuvenate and needs breaks in order to perform at its optimal level. But these types of activities, surfing the web, checking your email, looking at your Facebook page, these are fake breaks. They don't actually reset your willpower, reset your focus, or help you increase your energy. They're actually making it worse. Now, in a later lecture, I'm going to show you how to use pit stops to give yourself real breaks that will actually reset and rejuvenate your brain back to its optimal performance. But for now, what I want you to do is take inventory of your productivity, and over the next day or so, track and write down how often you're taking fake breaks and how often you stay sidetracked before you get back on track. And later on in this course, we're going to show you how to use breaks to your advantage. Welcome back. So our next silent killer of your productivity is something that I think many people take for granted. And that's how big an impact your emotional state or energy level plays at any particular time. You see, at any moment, you can have a huge influence on how you feel. Another term for that might be mood. You can feel like this guy on the left who's down and out, and when you're in a bad mood, are angry, frustrated, or sad, how productive are you? How likely are you to attack your priorities and do your best work? Not likely. Now, if you feel like my man on the right, you're much more likely to pick up that phone, to make the important phone call without hesitation, and dive right into your most important tasks, and you're much more likely to be successful. Now, the thing is, for most people, their mood is usually determined by external circumstances. If you're having a bad day, they're in a bad mood. If they're having a good day, they're in a good mood. But it doesn't have to be that way. There are a multitude of strategies at your disposal to influence your mood or emotional state at any given time. How you use your body in any given moment is just one example. Amy Cuddy, a social psychologist and professor at Harvard Business School, delivered a great TED Talk that shows the power of influence we have on ourselves, and specifically regarding the way that we use our own body. In her studies, she put participants into high power poses or low power poses for just 2 minutes. Now you'll see over here on the left, we've got our high power poses. This one right here has been dubbed the Wonder Woman pose. But in each one of these scenarios, you'll see that they're making their body wide or expanding their stance. And over here on the right-hand side, you're going to see low power poses. They're making themselves small or closing their body language. And after just 2 minutes, they test the participants' hormone levels to see if it had any effect. And quite frankly, I found the findings astounding. Now, those who struck the high power pose saw a 20% increase in testosterone and a 25% decrease in cortisol. Cortisol being a hormone most times associated with stress. And those that spent 2 minutes in the low power poses saw a 10% decrease in testosterone and a 15% increase in cortisol. These weren't just subjective question and answers of how a person described that they felt after these, situations, but actual hormonal changes. I'm going to go into even more detail in future lectures on how to use this type of stuff to your advantage, where we really get into designing our own blueprint for unstoppable productivity. But for right now, I just want you to understand the impact that you control over how you feel in any given moment. But for right now, I simply want to ask you, who's making the decision on how you feel at any given moment? Are you leaving it up to external circumstances, to other people to push your buttons, to depend upon what's going on out there in the world, or are you taking control of how you feel?
or at school and have many goals you want to accomplish. This might be a time of motivational struggle. You find yourself having trouble doing your work, exercising, and eating healthily. So you blame yourself for not having more willpower or for procrastinating too much. According to behavioral science, you can stop worrying about your willpower and quit calling yourself procrastinator. To stay motivated, you need to change your circumstances and outlook, not your personality. I'm Ayelet Fishbeck, a behavioral scientist at the University of Chicago. I've been studying what it takes to be successful in goal pursuit for over 20 years. As an academic, a parent, and an immigrant, I've also struggled with motivation myself. Let me offer a few interventions that can increase your productivity at work, school, and beyond. When monitoring progress, looking back is often the way to move forward. For any goal, you can look back at what you have achieved as well as forward at what is still left to do. When Mingjang Koo and I surveyed people standing in a long line for an amusement park ride in South Korea, we found that when they looked back and saw how far they'd come, they were more motivated to wait. Back at the University of Chicago, when uncommitted students look back at the materials that they have already covered for a final exam, their motivation to keep studying increased. Beware of long middles. We call it the middle problem. We are highly motivated at the beginning. We want to reach our goal and we want to do it right. Over time, our motivation declines as we lose steam. To the extent that our goal has a clear endpoint, as in the case of graduating with a diploma, our motivation will pick up again toward the end. In one experiment, Rima Tour-Tillery and I found that people literally cut corners in the middle of a project. We handed our participants a pair of scissors and asked them to cut out several identical shapes with many corners. They cut through more corners in the middle of the task. The solution? Keep meals short. A weekly healthy eating goal is better than a monthly eating healthy goal, as it offers fewer days to cheat on your diet. It's hard to learn from feedback, especially negative one. Emotionally, failures bruises the ego. We tune out missing the information feedback offers. Cognitively, people also struggle. The information in negative feedback is less directed than information in positive feedback, whereas success points us to a winning strategy. From failure, people need to infer what not to do. To increase learning from negative feedback, try giving advice to others who might be struggling with a similar problem. Lauren S. Chris Winkler, Angela Duckworth, and I found that when students, job seekers, and overweight individuals gave others advice on how to succeed in studying, finding a job, and eating healthily, they were more motivated to follow through. Support intrinsic motivation. You're intrinsically motivated when you pursue an activity that feels like an end in itself. You do something for the sake of doing it. If you wish you had a few more minutes to finish your work by the end of the day, you're intrinsically motivated. If you can't wait to go home, you aren't. To increase intrinsic motivation, start with selecting activities that you enjoy pursuing. A workout that you actually enjoy is more likely to become part of your routine. Often people choose the wrong activity. In an experiment, Caitlin Woolley and I asked people to choose between listening to the song Hey Jude by the Beatles and listening to a loud alarm. Seemed like an obvious choice, right? But the majority of the people chose the alarm because it paid more. Later, these people regretted their choice. Whether you look back, cut the middle, give advice, support intrinsic motivation, keep in mind, success does not require changing yourself. To stop procrastinate, modify your situation and outlook.
Thank you so much, Ayala. That was wonderful. And I'd love to get into some of the pieces that you suggested. And I think maybe one place to really start is this idea of intrinsic motivation. So could you talk a little bit about intrinsic motivation? What is it and why is it so important?
Yes, intrinsic motivation.
Hi, I'm Murray Schweitzer, professor at the Wharton School. I teach negotiations and advanced negotiations, and my research interests are in trust, deception, and emotions. I'm a co-author of Friend and Foe, and I'm interested in the topics we'll be talking about in this course. The tension between cooperation and competition, how we navigate our social relationships with topics like trust, deception, and apologies, putting those pieces back together. And I'm interested in communication more generally, as well as motivation. We'll talk about goal setting when it goes in the right direction, and sometimes when it gets us into trouble. Thanks for joining me, and let's get started. The line between cooperation and competition is surprisingly thin. As an example, think about what happens in Thanksgiving. We have Black Friday sales here in the United States that really trigger the holiday season, and sometimes you see huge crowds mob stores in anticipation of a great sale. So outside of these stores, here's one mob that was mobbing a store. People often end up in fistfights. One particularly sad occasion when Black Friday really took on a different term was in 2008 in upstate New York. There was a crowd of people that had gathered outside of a store. They were literally chanting, "Tear the doors down, tear the doors down," eager to get into this store. Well, the employees had formed a human chain trying to hold the shoppers back. And as the customers stormed into the store, they literally took the doors off the hinges, and they ended up trampling Jay Dittmar to death. Now, many of the employees end up scampering up onto vending machines trying to get out of the way. People were injured, and in one case, killed. Now, what's ironic here is that the Thanksgiving holiday celebrates cooperation. We think about the historic cooperation between the early American settlers and the Native American Indians. And here we celebrate this time of family and cooperation, and yet we juxtapose this with these sales and often a big mad rush that creates a lot of conflict. And this occasion in 2008 and that early photo that I showed you before is not an isolated incident. We routinely see this idea of holiday spirit. Here, this Huffington Post headline, "Shootings, Stabbings, and Brawls." And then here, in other cases, people actually stealing from each other, trying to get the best deals. So what I want to think about is how we navigate this tension. What pushes us from cooperation to competition, or from competition to cooperation? And this Thanksgiving example, we have the cooperative meal and then this competitive dash for these holiday sales. But I think a more dramatic example of a shift from competition to cooperation is represented in the relationship between the United States and Japan. As we all know, the conflict in World War II was intense. Here, this is a photo of firebombing in 1941. We had intense conflict. The United States firebombed 67 Japanese cities, in addition to dropping 2 atomic bombs, culminating in 1945, and the Japanese ultimately surrendered. So the conflict between the United States and Japan could not have been more intense. And yet, immediately after that conflict, there was a pivot to cooperation. And General MacArthur, when they took over in Japan, shifted immediately to cooperation, made it illegal for any American to strike a Japanese person, even made it illegal for Americans to eat Japanese food because there was such a food shortage on Japan. Americans who were there could only eat the American rations. Now, we moved forward. We ended up cooperating, rebuilding factories, and here you see this cooperation through the 1950s, culminating in this Declaration of Cooperation signed in 1960. And today, you'd be hard-pressed to find citizens that are more pro-U.S. than those in Japan. So we see this remarkable shift from competition to cooperation. Now, this happens not just on the global stage, not just in terms of shopping malls, but it happens in our most intimate relationships. We think about parenting. Parenting, you can't be more intimately cooperative with someone other than your partner, and think about the cooperation that goes into raising a child. And yet, even with raising a child, there's competition. There's competition with your spouse of who's going to sleep, who's going to change or feed the baby. And we have competition even within our most intensely cooperative relationships. So the idea is that we shift between cooperation and competition, and we often balance cooperation and competition even in our most intense relationships. Now think about siblings. So with siblings, we often think about sibling love, but at the same time we think about sibling rivalry. Now here's one example of sibling love. We think about it with humans, but it turns out the ground squirrel teaches us something really important about siblings. Ground squirrels are actually incredibly altruistic. When a predator is nearby, say a bird overhead, or another large animal, ground squirrels will screech to warn others to get out of the way. Now, by screeching, they're drawing attention to themselves. It puts them at risk. It makes them vulnerable to some attack. As scholars have looked at the volume with which ground squirrels screech, and it turns out they screech loudest when a predator is near their sibling. So we see sibling love even among ground squirrels. And so we have this incredible relationship with our siblings, and yet sibling rivalry can be incredibly intense. These are our closest friends and also sometimes our closest rivals as we compete for things like parental attention and investment. For twins, it starts particularly early. Even in the womb, twins start competing for resources. Now, more generally, we think about collaborating at work. We need to collaborate with our colleagues at work to accomplish joint goals, but then we're also competing for things like recognition, promotion, and raises. So both at home and at work, we're both cooperating and competing, and we need to figure out how to manage this tension and navigate this balance. So the idea is that we're competing and cooperating all the time, and often within the same relationships at the same time. I want to think about three principles that cause us to shift between cooperation and competition. They transform us from friends to foes and back again. So we think about the interplay of these three principles. The first principle is scarcity. The resources in our environment can either be scarce or plentiful, and that's what drives us from friend to foe. We think about scarcity, and this is exactly what happened in Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving, with this feast, we have abundant resources, and we're celebrating a cooperative event. But then we go out into the marketplace, and these scarce deals cause us to compete fiercely for these scarce resources of low-priced TVs and other things. Now, we see scarcity not just in humans shifting us between cooperation and competition, but in studies of animals, we see the same thing. A study of Grevy zebras found that the zebras actually behave differently as a function of how much water was available in their environment. When water was abundant, they formed one type of collectives, and when water was scarce, they formed a very different kind of collective. That is, their social relationships shifted dramatically as a function of how scarce this very precious water resource was. Now, the second principle is how social we are. We're inherently social beings. We crave companionship. In fact, one of the worst forms of punishment is solitary confinement. After just a few days, the human mind begins to decay in solitary confinement. People experience hallucinations, spasms of anger, malaise, and apathy. We both crave human contact after being in solitary confinement, and we're also unfit for it. The human mind needs to be socially connected. The third principle is dynamic instability. The world around us is stochastic, it changes, it's unstable. Just like the stock market, things are shifting all around us, and we need to quickly change and pivot between cooperation and competition. So this unstable and dynamic world, as we learn new information, we try to gather new information, it causes us to both cooperate and compete. And it's really the interplay between these three principles: scarcity, the sociability, and dynamic instability that cause us to pivot back and forth between cooperation and competition, and sometimes we're engaging in both at the same time, and we need to find our balance as both competitors and collaborators. What I want to talk about next are comparisons. And I want to break down the mechanics of the comparisons that we make and argue that they're a very fundamental force in our lives. They help us understand some interesting puzzles. Here's one. Why are twins separated at birth often so similar? Take Tom Peterson and Steve Tazumi. They were twins separated at birth. The two grew up in completely different households, different religions, different schooling, and yet when they got together, they were shocked at how similar they were. One owned a bodybuilding gym and was a complete fitness addict. The other owned a bodybuilding gym and was totally into fitness. And when they got together, they said, oh, we connected from the first time we met because we're so much alike. I want to think about that question. That is, why might twins separated at birth end up being so similar? Here's a second puzzle. Why do expectant fathers gain weight when there's no biological reason for them to gain weight? By understanding the comparison process, we could gain insight into these puzzles. Now, here's the first key idea. The comparisons we make help us make sense of our world. They help us understand if we went on a good vacation, if we're making a good salary, if I need to redo my kitchen, if I need to buy a new car. It's comparisons that help us make meaning out of all of these different outcomes we have in our lives. Now, here's some other key ideas about comparisons. First, they're inevitable. All of us make comparisons. Now, some of us are drawn to check Facebook more often than others, but all of us are drawn to make these comparisons, and they help us make sense of things, but they also drive us to feel better or motivate us or to feel worse. Now, part of how they work are we make comparisons that are sometimes going up, people who have done better than we have, people who have nicer apartments, nicer cars, or comparisons where we look down, people who might not have accomplished as much as us. Upward comparisons can inspire us. They can also make us miserable. Downward comparisons can make us feel content and satisfied, but are less motivating. Another key idea about comparisons is that we can make them within ourselves and with other people. So often the comparisons we make are to somebody else. So it could be our neighbor, it could be our brother-in-law, it could be the person in the cubicle next to me. But we can also make internal comparisons where I think about how I did before, or the comparison of what I could have done. So these internal comparisons relative to me, or comparisons relative to others. When are comparisons most intense? It turns out there are three dimensions that make comparisons more or less impactful. The first dimension is similarity. By similarity, we're thinking about things like siblings. And the closest sibling is a twin, where we have very intense similarity. So the more similar we are, the more these comparisons matter. And it's not just siblings, it could be very close friends, people that we find ourselves similar to in the same cohort, we might have started in the same class together. Similarity is really important. And in fact, this similarity helps us understand things like the spread of obesity. So one reason why expectant fathers gain weight, even though there's no biological reason for them to do so, is they're comparing themselves to people right next to them. And so the husbands and wives are comparing themselves, and that comparison impacts motivation. We can see from these graphs here, first, there's some kinds of comparisons that matter most. Those are comparisons where it's actually both of us see ourselves as friends, so those are going to be the strongest friendships, and where we're comparing ourselves to the same sex others. So the more similar the person, the more impactful that comparison is. And in fact, we see this network that helps explain the spread of obesity through friendships, through the network, the comparisons that we're making, we find ourselves motivated. So when I see everybody else around me reaching for a donut, I figure, well, I don't think I should eat more donuts, but if everybody else is doing it, or if that sort of look looks fine to me, everybody else in my comparison set is influencing my own assessment of what is or isn't acceptable. Now, for similar reasons, reunions can be quite stressful because at reunions we're going back and we're engaging in intense comparisons. So it could be a high school reunion, it could be a family reunion. There we're going to see people with whom we're likely to make comparisons. These are people from our same cohort or the same family structure. They started perhaps in similar circumstances, and now we're going to make these comparisons because of similarity. The second dimension is proximity. So you think about some of the most intense rivalries, like the Tar Heels and Blue Devils, UNC and Duke. Here we're looking at rivalries. These are two schools separated by just 9 miles with very strong basketball teams. And that intense rivalry is in part fueled by proximity. Now, proximity is also not just between universities, but it's things like neighbors. So here in this quote from Borat, we see this intense neighbor comparison where we're thinking about going back and forth who has what in their homes until he says, oh, great success, when he finally gets something that his neighbor can't have. So here we have the first two, similarity and proximity. The third thing that makes comparisons particularly intense is self-relevance. By self-relevance, I mean something that we care about. So if I really care about advancing my career, who gets that promotion is self-relevant. When my neighbor wins a baking competition, and I don't consider myself much of a baker, that lacks self-relevance, and as a result, that comparison isn't very intense. So the most intense comparisons are people who are similar, like brothers, cubicle mates, neighbors, my brother-in-law. Proximity, people who are very close to me physically. And then self-relevance, a domain that I really care about. So if I'm a musician, I care about winning that musical competition, but if I'm not, then I care less. Social comparisons have these characteristics, and they influence a few different behaviors. We've already alluded to some of those so far. The first is how we collaborate with other people. So as we learn information, it can change the way we collaborate or compete with others. So we might find that somebody else is making more money than we are. That might make collaboration harder. Or we might find that somebody else has a very different background than we do, and that might make collaboration easier and mitigate the intense comparisons we might otherwise have made. So comparisons can make us collaborate or compete, but they can also lead us to retreat altogether. So sometimes comparisons can be so unpleasant, we want to exit the situation because we find it so invidious. So we've thought about how comparisons can be motivating, but they can also have some adverse consequences as well. And here we want to think about some of the bad in comparisons. I want to draw on some of the work by Franz de Waal, where what he did is he actually studied how caterpillar monkeys, very clever monkeys, reacted to unfairness. He taught these monkeys to use stones for money, where he gave them stones. Experiment would come out, open up their hands, and receive a stone, and then hand the monkey some reward, like a slice of cucumber. It turns out these monkeys would engage in this transaction all day long. They love cucumbers, and they're happy to hand over the stones. That is, until they see a neighbor, a monkey in a cage next to them, getting something better than a cucumber.
So let me introduce the solution. At this point in the course, we already learned a lot about React, though I will say there also is more left to be learned. But everything we learned up to this point was about React doing things inside of our app in the browser. And of course, that is why we do use React. That is its main job. But we also only worked with local data up to this point. So we only played around with dummy data, which was always just managed and stored in the browser. In this course section, we are going to dive dive into how you may connect your React application to a backend, to a database. Because of course, many applications, probably all applications, need to fetch data from a database or store some data in a database eventually. No matter if we're talking about users that need to be created and stored and logged in, or if we're talking about products that need to be loaded, or anything like that. And therefore this section is about establishing such a connection, and it is about sending HTTP requests from inside our React app to a backend. And specifically, we are going to learn how exactly React apps do interact with databases, because whilst it's simple, as you will learn, it will not necessarily work as you expect it to work. You will learn how you can send HTTP requests and work with responses which you get back. And we're going to have a look at how we can handle errors and loading states in our application. Now, before we dive into any demo or any code, let's understand how React apps do talk to databases. And as you can tell by the title of this slide, it's not working as you maybe thought it works. Because React apps, or in general, browser-side apps, browser-side code, so JavaScript code running in the browsers, should never directly talk to a database. So if you have a React app, and then some kind of database, SQL database, a NoSQL database like MongoDB, it does not matter. If you have such a database running on some database server, then of course you might want to fetch and store some data, and you might want to establish a connection, but that's not what you should do, and that's not what you'll ever see out there in the wild unless it's a highly insecure and bad written application. Because if you would directly connect to a database, if we leave aside that this will technically be challenging, but if you would do that, if you would directly connect to a database server from inside your client side, your browser side JavaScript code, you would expose your database credentials in that code. Because you must never forget that all JavaScript code running in the browser can be accessed and read not just by the browser, but also by the users of your website. Simply open up the developer tools and you can view all the code there. This generally is no problem, and attached you find a more detailed article and video which I created on this. But of course it will become a problem if you expose security relevant details in your code. For example, credentials that allow access to a database. In addition, directly connecting to a database could also bring other problems like performance issues, but the security problem is the biggest problem of all. So therefore, instead of directly talking to a database from inside your React app code, you always take another route. You have a backend application running on another machine, not running in the browser, but running on some server out there. Maybe on the same server as the database, often on a different server though. Now, this backend application can be written with any server-side language of your choice. Node.js, PHP, ASP.NET, everything is possible. And it's this backend application which will do the talking to the database. Because you can safely store and use database credentials on the backend application, since that backend code can't be viewed by your users. It's on a different server, and the users of your website will never see that code. And therefore, the React app will then talk to that backend server, to that backend API typically, which is a server which exposes different URLs requests can be sent to, and we're going to see this throughout this section. And then you have a safe connection to the database, because the credentials are on this backend app, and for talking to the backend app, no security relevant details are needed. This is how this works, and this is what we're going to see in action in this course module. Now I prepared another dummy application for you. Of course you find it attached. It has two dummy movies which are being rendered here, and this button which currently doesn't do anything. Now the code for this is fairly straightforward. It's an app component which renders a section with this button and which then renders a movies list component, and currently I just have some dummy movie data which is fed into the movies list. And in the movies list I simply loop through these movies to output the individual. movie components which render list items with, well, this content. And that brings this here to the screen. Now at this point in this application, as I said, we're just using some dummy data here. I want to change this now. I want to fetch data from a database which contains some example movies. And for that, I'll use the Star Wars API. You can visit swappy.dev for Star Wars API. And here you have a little dummy API with some dummy data which you can send requests to play around with it, basically. Now, I will say right away, this is an API. It's a backend app. It's not a database because of what I explained in the last section. Behind the scenes, it of course probably uses some database to store some data about the Star Wars movies, but we interact with this backend app. And I said API a couple of times. API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it's a very broad term, not just related to React and HTTP requests. In the end, it means that in our code, we're dealing with something which has a clearly defined interface, clearly defined rules on how we can achieve certain results and do certain tasks. And when we talk about APIs in the context of HTTP requests, we typically talk about REST or GraphQL APIs, which are basically two different standards for how a server should expose its data. Now, this is a REST API, and it simply means that there are a couple of URLs, like this URL which you see here, to which you send a request to get back data in a certain format. And different URLs to which you send different requests will give you different chunks of data. That's what makes it an API. You got different entry points which lead to different results. If you want to learn more about REST APIs and what exactly that all is, you'll also find a helpful resource on that attached to this lecture. So here we can basically send a request to this URL, for example, to get information about a certain person from the Star Wars movies. We can also grab this URL here and send a request to swappy.dev/API/films, and we will later get back a response with a bunch of objects describing the different films, the different Star Wars movies, with, for example, the opening crawl text and the title, the episode ID, and so on. Now, this is just a dummy API which I want to use for getting started with sending HTTP requests. That's why I'm having a look at this first. And this is the API to which we now want to send requests from inside our React application here to populate this list of movies here with some real data instead of our dummy data. And how does this now work in React? Now, when it comes to sending requests from inside React apps, we must not forget that in the end we're still writing regular JavaScript code, right? A React application in the end is just a JavaScript application. That is what it's all about. And since that is the case, we can of course use any send HTTP requests in JavaScript solution which we want. For example, there is a package called Axios which you could use. You can visit it on GitHub, which makes sending HTTP requests and dealing with responses very, very simple, no matter which JavaScript library you might be using. You can even use it without any library. But nowadays, we also have a built-in mechanism for sending HTTP requests from inside JavaScript, and that's the Fetch API. The Fetch API is built into browsers, and it allows us to fetch data and actually also to send data, even though the name doesn't imply it. And we can use that to send HTTP requests and work with responses. And therefore it's the Fetch API which I want to use here to get my movies. Now we can start simple and make sure that whenever this button here is clicked, we do fetch movies and then we display the movies. And for that, I will simply remove my dummy movies here and instead add a new function here which I'll name fetch movies or fetch movie handler. Fetch movies handler is probably a better name, like this. And in here we can now use fetch, this function, because that's a function the browser makes available to us. That's this Fetch API being used. And in its simplest form, we just need to pass in as a string the URL to which you want to send a request. So in my case, swappy.dev/API/films. To be precise, HTTPS and then that URL. We could provide a second argument here, which allows us to pass in a JavaScript object where we configure various options. For example, where we add extra headers or an extra body, or change the HTTP request method. But here we don't need that, because the default method will be get, so the response object, continue in the next line of code and use the result immediately. Instead, let's ignore that and let's focus on the then case. Back data in also is a utility OK field, which will, it's just JSON, which is a built-in method on that response object. And this will now do this transformation. Now this itself then again returns a promise, and therefore what we should do here is return that promise and then add another then block here, this structure here. So it's an object, this array, like this, and then store these results in some state, which we then update in this place here, and which we then use here for movies list. Results in some state, which we then update in this place here. And which we then use here for movies list. So let's add use state, it movies and set movies. That's put here is that in my application here, I'm actually extracting title, release date, and opening text from the data I receive. Now there will be movies state. And now we just gotta forward movies here as a value for the movies prop. Now one thing to note here is that in my application here, I'm actually extracting title, release date, and opening text from the data I receive. Now there will be a title key, but opening text is actually called opening underscore crawl here, and release date is called release underscore date here. So we either adjust the prop names here, which I expect, or we make sure that we transform the incoming data from this format here to the format we expect in our app. And I'll do the latter. So in app.js, where we are making that HTTP request, before setting the data, the results as a new state, I'll actually transform them. So here I'll have my transformed, which is this array we're getting back, .map, to convert every object in the results array into a new object. And it's then the new objects, the array full of new objects, which will be stored and transformed moved here. Translate this into just an ID field in the data I'm working with here in my front end. Now for the title, we access moviedata.title all. So the text stored in this opening crawl, that will be movie here with set movies. Now to make sure that everything works, we now have to connect fetch movies handler, this function, to this button. And therefore, of course, here we add on click and point at fetch the React application. And no move, therefore from a backend app, which in turn is talking to a database. And that in a nutshell is how you do connect to a database